Walking in, you say,
All rise.
Honorable
Honorable
Dr. Small,
Dr. Small,
Judge,
Judge,
now presiding. Presiding, yeah.
Preside.
Okay, you may be seated. Okay, Bella, would you please swear in the jury? Yeah, just go over there and make each other. You don't talk. Oh, there.
Again.
Yeah. All right, so you please stand. You literally can't see it. Okay. Oh, that they'll judge, that they will service juries and judge impartially. They gotta raise their right hands.
Raise your right hand. I say that.
Yeah.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm
Do you solemnly swear
that you will render a verdict
that you will render a verdict
based solely on
based solely on
the testimony in this courtroom today?
the testimony in this court today?
And say I do.
I do.
All right.
Okay, so I call this court into session. This is the matter and case of New York Times Company versus the United States of America. Just as background information and facts to make sure that we're all on the same page. The issue before the court is whether or not executive privilege extends to the First Amendment freedom of the press when the executive claims a national security risk as a result of information being published. And by the executive, we mean the President of the United States. So this is a First Amendment case involving the United States executive branch and the New York Times newspaper. As background, this case occurs at the time in which the Vietnam War is going on, and it's controversial insofar as it is unpopular for people to publish things in the United States that's contrary to the war. Daniel Ellsberg is a former military analyst who came upon information, and I imagine that the counsels will tell us exactly how he came upon information. But at any rate, he came upon information, and it was security, top secret information, and he wanted to use it to publish against the war. The facts of the case will be introduced, or many of the other facts of the case will be introduced by both sides. But other things that you need to know is that Ellsberg gave the information that he came upon to the New York Times and to the Washington Post to publish, and that Ellsberg was doing this at the time in which the Nixon administration, and we might hear from President Nixon in this particular case, but at the time in which the Nixon administration wanted a hold on very important papers called the Pentagon Papers. So those are the facts that you need to know for the case. You know the issue before the court, and I ask both counsels, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Are you ready to proceed, officer?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, great. So at this time, I'll call forth the plaintiff to offer us your opening speech. Here.
Here, here. Here, here.
Your Honor, jury, ladies and gentlemen of the court, we have been given the question of whether or not a newspaper can be told not to publish something just because the certain president in question being Richard Nixon, told them not to. This is a question of the First Amendment. This is the question of your rights as Americans. This is the question of whether newspapers and the press or anyone should be allowed to talk about whether the government is doing the right thing. And as we have seen from the founding of our country and from the freedoms that we enjoy today, we should be. And that is the case that we are going to make today for you. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, today we hope that our case is going to make you believe, in fact, that Daniel Ellsberg did not violate any sort of act, either the Espionage Act or anything else that President Nixon may have been accusing him from in publishing the Pentagon Papers. In fact, we are going to make it so that you believe and agree with us in saying that Daniel Ellsberg had to have published the Pentagon Papers, and there was no other way he could have done it any other way.
Hear, hear.
So with that, we trust that you will make the right decision today and vote for the plaintiffs to continue to uphold our rights as Americans and our First Amendment rights. Thank you. Here.
Okay, counsel, I have a few questions for you before you take your seat.
Of course,
Please
Your Honor.
approach the branch. So you made the claim that Ellsberg had to publish the Pentagon Papers. Can you give me some evidence for believing that he had to publish these papers?
As I have said, Your Honor, this was something that I was intending to go forward with in my argumentation. However,
Okay.
I will in fact answer your question now if you would like.
No, let me indicate to the jury, then pay special attention to the conversation about the Pentagon Papers, because you want to know why counsel believes that Ellsberg had to publish those papers. Okay, so I have a second question for you, a follow-up if you would.
Of course, Your Honor.
Great. Do you have a precedent for your case that you'd like for the jury to hear, or is that also going to be brought up as you extrapolate more in your case?
I would like to bring up Near v. Minnesota, which establishes the doctrine of prior restraint. As I have said in my opening remarks, this case is about whether the executive, that is the President Richard Nixon, can stop something from being published. And this case, I believe, of Near v. Minnesota does support our claim that it is unconstitutional for him to do so.
Okay, and you mentioned something called prior restraint.
Indeed.
Are you going to elaborate on this as your case unfolds, or would you like to talk to them about the doctrine of prior constraint?
The doctrine of prior restraint, as I have indicated, but I shall explain more fully, is the idea that while the president cannot in fact infringe upon rights after the publication of certain news materials, he can stop them from being published or edit them before being published, which is another unconstitutional infringement upon the First Amendment rights. But
Okay, so I will instruct the jury to pay special attention to the doctrine of prior restraint. Here, the question is whether or not you believe that it is a violation of the United States Constitution. And I have one more question for you. And that question is, could you give us some indication of the context in which this case occurs? So for example, is the United States at war?
yes, the United States during this case is in fact at war in Vietnam. And that is why the Pentagon Papers are relevant and why they are being published at this time, because the United States is at war, and while President Nixon or the respondents may try to make you think that that is a good enough reason for President Nixon to stop the publication of certain materials, it is not. Because we are in wartime, that does guarantee we should give protections to our troops. However, that does not guarantee that we should be infringing upon First Amendment rights back at home, where the publishing of these papers, which we will get into later, is going to in fact harm anyone.
Okay, thank you, counsel. Those are the only questions that I have at this time. And we will allow the defendants to give their opening statement before we have you call witnesses, since so much of your case has been deferred to later.
Of course. Thank you, Your Honor.
And the counsel for the defendant, are you prepared to give your opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, proceed.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, honorable judge. Thank you for having us here today, and we are going to be talking about the issue of Mr. Ellensburg infringing on the United States' obligation to uphold security and safety for the people within the
Objection.
nation.
Yes, I'll hear your objection.
The plaintiff would like to know whether the counsel has read, in fact, what the name of the witness is.
Okay, for clarity purposes, counsel, could you please restate the name of the defendant?
Yes, Your Honor. Daniel Ellsberg.
Okay, thank you. For clarity purposes, the defendant shall be referred to as Ellsberg from henceforth.
Yes, my mistake. I will not be bullied from henceforth. So, to continue. We believe on the respondent's side that the United States has an overriding obligation to protect the security of the state. Yes, we are in a time of war, so what does this mean? This means that we have certain statutes within the Constitution that allow for authority like the president or other governmental bodies to impose certain restrictions on our rights as to protect the rights of everyone else. So this is things like the Espionage Act of 1917, which denies people the right to extend their First Amendment rights in order to prohibit them from revealing information that could be dangerous to the security of the state. And so within our argument, we are going to be using the precedent of Dennis v. the United States, which was decided in 1951, which tells us that people cannot advocate for the violent overthrowing of the government in favor of protecting the security of the state. So I hope within our case that we'll make it clear to you that Mr. Ellsberg was actually denying people the right to safety and the United States' obligation to fulfill that right. And with that, I have no more to say. Thank you.
Okay, counsel, before you take this, I have a few questions for you.
Yes.
And is much of your case also going to be postponed until after the plaintiffs initiate their case?
Yes.
Okay, and so you'll introduce additional precedents and maybe talk about the Constitution at that time?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so then I won't question you on that stuff right now. I'll wait until the plaintiffs put forth their case. So, with that, let's get started, plaintiffs. It's your ground. Do you have a witness you'd like to call, or would you like to?
Would the judge prefer that we call our witnesses first or after our?
Give us your argument, then we'll call the witness.
Thank you. Honorable Judge, ladies and gentlemen of the court, jury, as I have said in my opening remarks, we are here to talk about whether or not President Nixon had the right to infringe upon the First Amendment of Daniel Ellsberg and the New York Times and Washington Post from publishing the Pentagon Papers. The respondents would have you believe from their opening remarks that they had an overriding state interest in order to stop this from happening for the safety of the people. They will say that the Pentagon Papers had sensitive information that shouldn't have been leaked in order to protect American lives. However, whatever they are telling you is wrong. Just so you know.
Shame.
Whatever they tell you, I would suggest you take with a grain of salt, considering the freedoms that you have as American people. Considering the fact that what the Pentagon Papers actually said had nothing to do with military operations. In fact, the Pentagon Papers, the only thing that they mentioned was how the U.S. government, dating back from the MacArthur administration, managed to have covert operations in Indochina in order to make the American public believe that we should start a war in that area. The Pentagon Papers only tell one story, not the story that the respondents would have you believe about certain military operations or sensitive information that could harm lives. The Pentagon Papers told one story, and that is a story of how our government has betrayed us and deceived us. And Daniel Ellsberg had an obligation, he had a duty as a member of the press to let us know, to let us, the American people, know, in fact, why that was wrong and why it is that the American government is not, why the American government needs to be held accountable for their actions overseas from the people voting them in at home. So with that, I rest my case.
Okay, and do you have a witness you'd like to call at this time?
Yes, I do.
Who's that witness?
I would like to call Daniel Ellsberg to the stand.
Okay, Daniel Ellsberg, come up to the stand, and bailiff, could you swear Daniel Ellsberg in? Just, I swear to tell the truth. I will truth and nothing but myself. Yeah, go over to him. Just I swear to tell him. Mr. Ellsberg.
Judge?
Do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Mr. Ellsberg, you may be seated.
Thank you.
Mr. Ellsberg, may you please clarify to the jury what it is that is in the Pentagon Papers?
So, starting in 1957, I became employed by the RAND Corporation, which was commissioned by the United States DoD, the Department of Defense, in order to create a brief that would be utilizable by members of the federal government in order to get them up to speed, so to speak, in terms of our engagement in Indochina. So when I say Indochina, I'm referring to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, these sorts of countries. Now, what is in the Pentagon Papers is a long history of U.S. deception and covert operations in the region, as the counselor intimated. But it goes much deeper than that. So starting in the early 1950s under President MacArthur, U.S. troops were inserted into countries like South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Cambodia, in order to support paramilitary organizations in these countries that were fighting communist-led forces with ties to Moscow. So over the years, the various administrations, starting with the Kennedy administration, recognized that it wasn't sufficient to have U.S. troops simply funding paramilitary organizations in countries like Cambodia and South Vietnam. Rather, we needed a harder tack. So President John F. Kennedy sent U.S. military advisors, in addition to more weapons, to the South Vietnamese government, led by President Diem. And President Diem was a noted strongman in South Vietnam. He persecuted Buddhists. He persecuted Buddhists in the country. He put political prisoners in relocation camps, and he was responsible for a large number of extrajudicial harms to the people of South Vietnam.
Okay. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, I do. Mr. Ellsberg, how did you come across the Pentagon Papers?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I'd like to make this one entirely clear. So I was working at RAND. RAND was given these documents by the United States Department of Defense. And my job in working for RAND was to go through the information and make sure that it was synthesizable for someone in a policy-making position to actually do something with the information. And so what I did is, across my desk every day, I would get reports dating back to the early 1950s from the MacArthur administration. And what I would do is I would take some of these documents noting, large-scale deceptions by the United States government or covert actions or the funding of humanitarian abuses in countries like Cambodia and South Vietnam, and I would save them. I kept them in a large file. And I did this for a number of years, and I actually kept the documents themselves in my house until I had a large enough repertoire of information to actually take it to the press. So in my regular activities as a member of the RAND Corporation, given documents by the Department of Defense, I accumulated the records that would one day become the Pentagon Papers.
Okay.
I rest my case.
Okay, thank you. And counsel, would you like to cross-examine the witness?
I would.
Great. It's your witness.
Mr. Ellsberg,
Counselor?
I have a few questions for you today, starting with, were you permitted to share this information within your employment contract or through any agreement via your employer? And by this material, I mean the Pentagon Papers and other important information that was leaked to the New York Times?
I wasn't permitted to leak the information, obviously, but I was given large-scale access to the information in my regular capacity as a member of the RAND Corporation. So I didn't steal any of the information. The information was given to me. I just collected the information after it was given to me and kept it away.
Yes. But did I ask if you stole it, or did I ask if you were allowed to release it to the press?
Well, the question of releasing it to the press, I think, is a separate question today. Because obviously, it might be the case that the administration would say, I ought not to have released the information to the press, but I think that's what's at issue. Namely, if there are abuses, large-scale abuses, going back decades, committed by the US government, it would be tantamount to me closing my eyes and saying, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, in order to keep this information secret. So, yeah, certainly I wasn't legally permitted, but I felt I had an obligation in order to make sure that this information became public, because people were making decisions and people were dying in Vietnam because of the information implicated in those papers.
Okay. And referring to your responses that you gave to the plaintiff in her cross-examination, you mentioned that you kept these documents within your home. And I'd like to just question you on the legality of that. Was that mentioned in your employment contract or in any legal
Objection.
document?
The objection is overruled. Continue with the question.
So what I'm asking is, did the RAND Corporation permit you to keep these documents within your home on any legal or moral basis?
Well, I will say, in the RAND Corporation, there wasn't a great deal of scrutiny paid to those people who might keep information, maybe take notes about it outside of the corporation, these sorts of things. Many of my coworkers, in fact, actually did similar stuff, just not to the same level as what I did. Namely, I took a lot of documents, because the Pentagon Papers is over 600 pages. I took a lot of documents, but many of my colleagues took smaller, less voluminous copies of these documents themselves.
So you're saying there's some discrepancies in the way in which RAND Corporation runs its services?
Yeah, I'm saying RAND sometimes will turn a blind eye when they become aware of this sort of behavior. And sometimes, at least in my case, they'll stamp down on it, particularly when it means they're going to lose a lucrative contract with the Department of Defense because of what I published.
So do you think in this way, if the RAND Corporation has shown to permit some sort of misconduct within its business, perhaps maybe the way in which it accumulates and distributes its information that it's collecting might also not be up to par?
So if by that you mean the information we're receiving from the Department of Defense, that is straightforwardly not true. I mean, we get the information directly from the DoD, right? None of the information that I was given in my work at RAND was somehow falsified, or did I insert anything, of personal interest in there. Rather, it all came from the United States government. And then in the process of reviewing it, I redacted the bits that implicated particular people at particular times, their names, locations of US military installations, these sorts of things that might actually harm US service people in South Vietnam. And so when I published them, after having redacted them, I got all of the information directly from DoD and then just took out the bits that were potentially harmful.
And then, do you think that in our current political climate there is a rift, so to speak, between the people of the nation and the US federal government? And do you think that something such as leaking information, going behind the government's back, going to news presses might actually further that rift and impose more distrust between the people of the United States and the US government?
Yeah, so with respect to counsel's question, there is a rift. And in fact, I would argue there ought to be a bigger rift. Because what the Pentagon Papers actually demonstrates is 25 years of covert operations, deception, and abuses by the United States federal government in order specifically to put young men in South Vietnam in order to fight a war that we ought not be in the first place. That's what the Pentagon Papers actually indicates, and they indicate all of this for one particular reason, namely a flawed foreign policy position on the part of the United States, dating all the way back to Harry S. Truman, which said we ought to fight communism wherever we see communism, and any means justifies those ends. And I'm telling you, the rift ought to be bigger because I firmly believe that the ends don't justify the means, specifically when we're committing humanitarian abuses in countries like South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. You get the picture.
Your Honor, may I convene with my counsel?
Yes. Okay, do you have a second witness you'd like to call?
Defense calls, what is it? Is it Richard Niss?
Okay, Ellsberg, you may return to your seat.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Oh, while I'm here today, I've got stuff to do.
By the way, that's the
Rita,
president.
would you swear in President Nixon?
It's a schedule and a water run.
Do you swear to tell the truth?
I do. I am not a crook.
Okay, President Nixon, you may take a seat. Hey, counsel,
We
your
are recording
witness.
you.
Oh, Mr. President.
Yes.
So, as you may have heard in one of our witnesses' responses to my questions, it was suggested that there is in fact a rift between our U.S. federal government and the people of the United States. And I would just like to ask, how do you view this rift? And do you think it should in fact be, quote, begin to get larger?
I think if there is a rift, which I believe there is, it's not at our fault. It's not at our causation. It's obviously from the leaker, the treacherous person that he is during time of war. Unfortunately, that rift is there, but you have to understand, as President of the United States, I have an important responsibility in our society and in our government under the powers given to me under the Constitution of the United States. And one of those is to ensure the safety of the United States in times of war. And although, with all due respect about the freedom of the press, there are other issues that should take priority and do take priority under legal precedents in the past.
So, do you believe that the releasing of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and them publishing it does pose an actual threat to not only members that are serving currently, but also the members of the United States?
Of course, it puts our boys in danger. No one wants their child to come home in that condition. We have a duty to get in and win this war, and that's exactly what I plan on doing. If you'll remember, for all my constituents out there, I did not start this war. I just took over in the administration. I'd like to point out, though, that I think this is treacherous. It's treason. It's jeopardizing the safety of the United States of America in times of a world conflict.
And addressing some of the questions that have been brought up about the RAND Corporation, do you think them overlooking some of the misconduct that they find in their corporation, such as people hiding documents from their authority or hiding them within their home, do you think that should be permitted?
Absolutely not. There's rules for that. In fact, that's illegal. Taking classified material outside of the classified limited boundaries of our government buildings and facilities, there's entirely years and years of precedent showing that that's just outright illegal. And to do that in times of war, like I said, that's treason.
Okay. And for my final question, do you believe that the activities of Mr. Ellsberg and the New York Times and other publications was in fact unconstitutional?
I certainly do. I think the actions that they did was unconstitutional. I think there are limitations on freedom of the press and freedom of the speech. And that's not just my thoughts, that's the thoughts that were embedded and enshrined in the Constitution of the United States.
Okay, no further questions.
Okay, counsel for the plaintiff, would you like to cross-examine the witness?
Yes, Your Honor, I would.
Okay, no witness.
President Nixon, it's an honor to speak to you. However, I would like to ask, what part of the Constitution limits the rights of the people?
Well, there have been definitely court cases when you balance, our system is based on a scale.
President Nixon,
You've asked the question, I'm trying to cooperate and answer your questions.
I would like to clarify my question.
Perhaps maybe you should sit here and answer your own question.
Counsel, witness, please keep the decorum. Let the witness answer the question.
Of
If
course.
you'd like to redirect, then simply ask a second question.
Of course, Your Honor. My apologies.
Okay, what was the question?
The question was where in the Constitution, the United States Constitution, does it put limits on the rights of the people?
Of course it does. There's past precedent over and over. We just had a case, Schick versus the United States, where there's limitations on freedom of speech. It depends on the balancing test. Our entire system, there's the blind lady with the scales of justice. You have to balance the different rights. You can't walk into a theater and yell, fire, fire, fire. Like I said, we're at time of war, and this is a case that the papers and the leaked information definitely would cause serious, grave damage to the security of our United States. And that outweighs the small right of one or two newspaper entities to publish an article for commercial gain.
President Nixon, I would like to ask, do you in fact know what's in the Pentagon Papers?
I can neither confirm nor deny that.
So, President Nixon, you would like to say that you have no idea what is actually in the Pentagon Papers?
Your Honor, I never said that.
Objection?
Plaintiff would like to suggest that a conclusion can be derived from a non-answer, and I would just like to object to that.
Objection is sustained. Move on, please.
So, President Nixon, I would like to ask, can you confirm or deny whether there is in fact any sensitive information in the Pentagon Papers in light of what Mr. Ellsberg has said?
Can I confirm or deny that there is sensitive information?
That there is sensitive information that could bring harm to soldiers in Vietnam.
Our whole point, my counsel can confirm or deny that it brings serious, grave harm. That's the whole point we're here. I directed my staff to put an injunction and halt the publication of those records because of that very point. So yes, I can confirm or deny that it would cause serious, grave harm. That's my role under the Constitution as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces.
I rest my case.
Okay, thank you. Mr. President, you may step down.
Thank you.
Okay, and so, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we'll now move to our closing arguments. So you'll hear closing arguments from both sides as to why you should vote for them. And so at this time, I'll call the defense counsel to offer us some closing remarks. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, honorable judge, thank you once again for the floor. And I'd just like to close off this trial that we're having here today to remind you of all of the important facts that might have been muddled through all of the discussion that we've been having here today. I wanted you to remind yourselves that the United States government has an overriding obligation in order to protect not only its citizens, but its U.S. service members who are still currently fighting in the Vietnam War. I'd also like to remind you that Mr. Ellsberg went behind the Rand Corporation's back, went behind the United States government's back,
Shame.
and solicited information that he had kept in his home, that he had kept away from himself, without going through proper channels in order to make sure that this information could be safely and securely released to the public or delivered to the public in any fashion that would actually uphold their safety and security. I'd also lastly like you to consider that our precedent that we set forth for you today has shown you that there is no instance wherein the overthrowing of the government is actually beneficial in any way, and here's why we've explained this to you. It's because people cannot uphold their safety and security.
Yes, I'll hear your objection.
The plaintiff would like to know where exactly counsel is getting the idea of overthrowing the government from.
Counsel, please.
Excuse me if I didn't clarify.
Counsel, address your comments to me and to the jury.
Within our precedent, we explained that there is this prohibition of overthrowing your government, and we took this today in our case to mean doing anything that goes against the government's obligation to provide safety for its citizens. I hope that clarifies things. And so in closing today's argument, I'd just like you to consider the safety of Americans as well as trying to fix this rift that we see between U.S. citizens and the U.S. federal government, to try and mend that rift in order to impose more trust between the two, so that at the end of the day, we have a better U.S. federal government that can actually protect us. And with that, we urge you to consider our side. Thank you.
Okay, and now I will call the counsel for the plaintiff to give us your closing argument. You have the floor.
Thank you, Honorable Judge.
Here, here.
Honorable Judge, members of the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the court, you should be angry. You should be angry that President Nixon came up here and told you that, yes, we sent your children to war. We sent your children to war on the basis of nothing. We, in fact, engineered the conditions for that war to happen.
Here, here.
And we engineered the conditions for that war to happen, and you should be thankful for it. That is the thing that President Nixon is trying to get you to believe. What the respondents are trying to get you to believe is that this is fine, that everything is fine, that this war is exactly what should be happening, and we need to support this war, this unconstitutional war. In fact, they would have you believe that your rights in the face of a war that you didn't ask for don't matter. So, members of the jury, when you are voting today, please keep in mind that voting on a jury is one of the last rights that President Nixon wants you to have left. And if you vote against, he might try to take that away too if you don't stop him.
Shame.
Here, here.
So, members of the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the court, the respondents have tried to confuse this case. They have tried to slander Mr. Ellsberg. They have tried to aggrandize our president. However, they have not given any actual reason as to why that's a reason to stop the publication of the papers. They have not given any reason to stop this, what shall I call it? To stop the propagation of truth in the face of the lies of the Nixon administration. So, members of the jury, when you are casting your vote, I ask that you make sure that you are voting for what is in your best interest and in the best interest of your children, your grandchildren, your families, your loved ones, in making sure that we don't go into any more wars that are engineered without our consent. Thank you.
Here, here.
Okay, now, jury, do you have a foreperson?
Yeah.
Is there, who's the foreperson of the jury? You are the foreperson? Okay, Madam Foreperson, talk to the rest of the members of the jury, figure out what their vote is. Are they gonna vote for New York Times, or are they gonna vote for the United States? So, here's New York Times, here's the United States.
So what do I, so
Find out who they're voting, who they
who
voting.
I was voting for the United States? So, and then who's gonna vote for the other one? The New York Times. The New York Times.
Okay, so ultimately, who did you want to vote for?
We voted for the New York Times.
So,